The tape sat in a metal box for 37 years. Frank Holloway found it buried beneath a stack of medical discharge papers and commendation letters that no longer meant anything to anyone. The label on the cassette was handwritten in faded blue ink, just a date and a location. March 14, 1987, Kandahar Province. Not the Ramadi night that everyone whispers about, not the 72 men who walked out of that valley in 2006. This was earlier, a different war, a different mistake that the army tried to bury long before Frank's name ever became synonymous with disobedience. He turned the cassette over in his hands, feeling the weight of it, the magnetic tape inside holding voices and decisions that were never supposed to exist in any official record. It wasn't the night that made him famous among the men who serve in silence. It was the night that made that decision in Ramadi inevitable. If you like stories like this, subscribe to the channel. The recording begins with static, the kind that makes you think of distance and secrecy. Then, a voice comes through, sharp and clear despite the years. It's not Frank's voice. It's Colonel Raymond Marsh, speaking from a command post 200 miles away, delivering an order that was supposed to be followed without question. Frank had served under Marsh for 7 years by that point, had learned to trust the man's instincts even when the logic wasn't clear. But that night, something in the colonel's voice was different. There was a tightness there, a forced certainty that made Frank's stomach turn even as he acknowledged the transmission. The order was simple. Hold position until reinforcements at dawn. No movement, no extraction, enemy closing from 3 sides. Dawn was 8 hours away. What Frank only understood years later, buried in Marsh's margin notes, was that someone else was on the command channel that night. A civilian voice that wasn't supposed to be there, speaking the careful language of people who give orders from offices thousands of miles away. Frank had been a captain then, leading a reconnaissance unit that wasn't supposed to see combat. They'd gone into the valley for a routine 48-hour intelligence op on insurgent supply routes. Instead, they walked into an ambush that killed 2 men in the first 5 minutes and pinned the rest in a dried riverbed surrounded by hills. The enemy knew exactly where they were. Someone had given them up, or the intel was wrong, or both. Didn't matter now. What mattered? 72 men trapped in a kill zone, and Marsh's order to wait for help that might not come. Frank could hear the gunfire on the tape, distant pops that sound harmless through decades-old recording. But he remembers how loud it was, how the sound echoed off canyon walls. He remembers the faces of his men, young soldiers who looked at him like he had answers. The decision came down to numbers and time. Frank calculated it 3 ways. Every scenario ended the same. If they stayed, the enemy would overrun them before dawn. The hills crawled with fighters, the defensive position deteriorating by the hour. They had ammunition for 90 minutes of sustained combat, and the nearest helicopter LZ was 5 miles across open ground. But there was another option, one Marsh had explicitly forbidden. A narrow canyon north, barely wide enough for 2 men side by side, that led into the mountains and eventually to a larger valley where extraction might be possible. Marsh said the canyon was a death trap, that intel suggested mines and enemy staging. Frank had studied the maps until his eyes burned, couldn't reconcile Marsh's assessment with what he saw on the ground. Enemy was pushing from east and south, not north. The canyon looked like their only real chance. He made the call at 2300 hours. Frank told his men to pack light and prepare to move, then got back on radio with Marsh. The conversation is on the tape, every word preserved in magnetic strips that should have been destroyed. Frank's voice is steady but tight, explaining his assessment and intention to relocate through the northern canyon. Long pause after he finishes. Then Marsh's voice returns, not a commanding officer anymore. Cold and final, the voice of someone who's written you off. The colonel repeats the order to hold position, adds the words every soldier understands. This is a direct order from theater command. Disobeying would be insubordination at best, possibly treason. Frank acknowledges one more time, voice neutral, then clicks off the radio and starts giving commands. They moved through the canyon in single file, 72 men carrying their wounded and their dead, moving as quietly as possible through terrain that could have been their grave. Frank walked point with his second-in-command, Lieutenant James Kearney, who never questioned the decision even though he knew what it meant. The canyon was exactly as dangerous as it looked. Narrow passages between rock walls, loose stones that clattered underfoot. Every sound felt like an announcement. Halfway through, one of the wounded started coughing, a wet, rattling sound that echoed off the walls. Frank had 3 seconds to decide. Stop and risk being heard, or keep moving and risk losing the man. He kept moving. The coughing stopped on its own, or maybe it didn't, and Frank just couldn't hear it anymore over 72 pairs of boots on ancient rock. Behind him, Kearney was counting steps, matching them against memorized coordinates. The count kept drifting because the map didn't account for rubble or switchbacks or places where they had to climb over fallen stone. But the mines Marsh warned about weren't there. The enemy staging area turned out abandoned, just debris and old shell casings. Frank found something else, though, something he never reported. Boot prints in the dust near the canyon entrance. American issue, less than 2 days old. Someone had been here recently, someone who knew the canyon wasn't mined, someone who walked this route and never reported it. The intelligence hadn't been wrong. It had been deliberately falsified. They reached the northern valley at 0430, sky lightening in the east. Frank called for extraction on a different frequency, bypassing Marsh, going straight to a helicopter unit that owed him a favor. 3 Chinooks came in fast and low, touched down long enough to load 72 exhausted men and lift them out. Not one more man died. Everyone made it out, even the wounded, even the 2 bodies they carried, because no one gets left behind. Frank remembers sitting in the helicopter climbing away, looking down at the valley, seeing muzzle flashes as enemy fighters realized their prey escaped. He remembers relief and dread in equal measure, knowing what came next. The court-martial took 4 months to organize and 3 days to conclude. Frank was charged with willful disobedience, conduct unbecoming, and reckless endangerment. The Army brought in witnesses who testified about chain of command and the importance of following orders, especially when you disagree. They brought in analysts who explained that Marsh's order had been based on solid intelligence. They never brought in any of the 72 men who walked out alive. Frank's lawyer argued the order was based on faulty intelligence, but the prosecution countered that Frank had gambled based on intuition rather than facts. Guilty on all counts. They didn't send him to prison. The Army handles these things quietly when optics are complicated. Frank got a dishonorable discharge, losing his pension, benefits, and the career he'd spent 2 decades building. At 43, with no prospects and a reputation that made defense work impossible, he moved to a small town where nobody knew his name. His wife left 6 months later, unable to live with a man who carried that weight. Frank worked construction and tried to forget. But the tape stayed with him, moved from place to place in a box he never opened. He told himself it was historical evidence. The truth was simpler. It was proof he'd made the right choice, even if nobody would acknowledge it. The years passed slowly, then quickly, the way they do when you're outrunning your story. Frank took a security consulting job with a small firm that didn't ask questions, married Helen, who had her own ghosts from field hospitals, and started to think maybe he could leave it behind. Then, 15 years after that valley, he started seeing the names. It began with Lieutenant James Kearney's obituary, forwarded as courtesy or reminder, dead at 49 in a car accident. Frank went to the funeral, standing at the back, listening to an eulogy that somehow omitted the canyon night. After the service, Kearney's son approached Frank with a message his father wanted passed along. Kearney had never regretted following Frank into that canyon, not once. He'd carried that night like a badge of honor, even one he could never wear publicly. More names appeared after that. Frank would see familiar names in news articles, men from his unit living ordinary lives because they survived. Some had families, kids growing up. Some built careers far from military, becoming teachers, engineers, business owners. A few stayed in the Army and rose through ranks, though they never mentioned Frank's name. He kept a list, cross-referencing with that night's roster, tracking lives that continued because of his decision. The list grew, and with it came satisfaction mixed with anger. These men thrived, yet the official record still called Frank reckless, said he'd endangered his unit through disobedience. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in October, 17 years after the court-martial. Plain envelope, no return address, Virginia postmark. Inside, one typed sheet, unsigned, Colonel Raymond Marsh had died 3 weeks earlier from lung cancer. Before death, he'd made arrangements. A storage unit in Falls Church contained files and recordings for Frank, plus an explanation letter. The key was taped to the bottom. Frank stared at the letter, deciding if it was real or a trap. He hadn't spoken to Marsh in 17 years, hadn't heard his name except during his own court-martial. That Marsh would leave him anything seemed absurd, possibly cruel. But the key was real, small and brass with a numbered tag. Frank put the letter in his pocket and drove to Virginia the next morning. The storage unit was in a facility near the highway, an anonymous building with rows of identical green doors. Frank found the right number and used the key, half expecting it to be empty. But the key turned smoothly, and when he rolled up the door, he found 3 cardboard boxes stacked in the corner, labeled in Marsh's handwriting with dates and locations from the late 80s and early 90s. The top box was labeled with the date Frank remembered, March 14, 1987. He carried all 3 to his car, drove to a motel on the edge of town, and locked the door before finally opening them. The first box contained files, operations reports, and intelligence summaries. Frank recognized some missions he'd been part of or heard about. He opened the first folder expecting routine paperwork, but the classification stamps were wrong. Documents marked confidential, stapled to others marked secret, which should never happen. Someone had been pulling files from different security levels, hiding the trail. Then Frank noticed the signatures. One name appeared twice on authorization forms 3 weeks apart, but completely different handwriting. Same name, different person signing. He set that aside and opened another. This one contained a tactical assessment for a Helmand Province mission Frank had never heard of, 14 casualties blamed on poor intelligence and equipment failure. But stapled to the back was a second assessment marked Eyes Only that told a different story. The casualties had been anticipated, factored into planning as acceptable losses to achieve an objective that wasn't even mentioned in the official report. Frank read through file after file, his hands shaking as the pattern became undeniable. Someone at a high level had been setting up operations to fail, putting soldiers in harm's way to create casualties that could justify budget increases, personnel rotations, policy changes. The files pointed in certain directions, referenced Pentagon meetings, alluded to congressional oversight committees that needed visible action to authorize continued funding. One document made Frank stop entirely. A memo dated 2 weeks before his Kandahar mission, outlining acceptable casualty. Projections for Southern Province operations. Target range: 60 to 80 personnel losses over 3 months, distributed across multiple small engagements to avoid media attention. 72 men trapped in a valley would have fit that projection perfectly. The second box contained audio recordings, cassettes like the one Frank had kept all these years. He spent the night listening to them on a player bought from a convenience store. The tapes were command channel recordings, conversations between theater command and field commanders. Frank heard his own voice on several, heard other officers he'd known, heard Marsh giving orders. But he also heard other voices he didn't recognize. One in particular kept appearing across multiple tapes, a man who never identified himself, who spoke with careful precision of someone accustomed to unquestioned obedience. This voice didn't use military terminology. He talked about acceptable loss ratios, public opinion metrics, maintaining visible presence for domestic consumption. He talked about soldiers like chess pieces, assets to be sacrificed for objectives having nothing to do with the war itself. On one tape, barely audible beneath static, Frank caught fragments of the conversation. The Senators' Committee needs visible engagement before appropriations vote, 70 to 80 casualties over the quarter, distributed across small engagements. Captain Holloway's unit is positioned. Marsh's voice, tight and reluctant. Understood. Frank had to stop the tape. He sat on the bed, hands shaking, understanding for the first time that his men hadn't been in that valley because of bad luck. They'd been placed there deliberately, positioned to die at a specific time to satisfy political requirements, having nothing to do with military necessity. Marsh had known. He'd delivered the order knowing it was a death sentence, knowing reinforcements were timed to arrive exactly late enough to make casualties inevitable. Except Frank had disobeyed. He'd pulled 72 men out of a kill zone designed to produce the body count some unnamed civilian needed for a congressional hearing. The remaining tapes showed similar patterns across different theaters, different commanders, but always the same structure. Small units positioned in untenable situations, orders prioritizing political optics over tactics, casualty projections treated as targets rather than risks. And running through all of it was that same unknown voice, never identifying himself, never appearing in official transcripts, giving orders that commanders followed because the chain of command demanded obedience. The third box contained one item, a letter from Colonel Raymond Marsh, written in dying man's shaky handwriting. Frank read it as the sun came up, traffic beginning on the highway. The letter wasn't quite an apology, but close as Frank would get. Marsh explained he'd been following orders that night, that the command to hold position came from 3 levels above him with explicit instructions to allow no alternative action. He'd known the order was wrong, had argued in an unrecorded meeting, but was overruled by people with political considerations outweighing tactical ones. The Valley operation was meant to produce casualties that could be presented to congressional committees as evidence of ongoing combat requiring continued funding. Frank's unit was the sacrifice, timing calculated to the hour. Enemy wasn't supposed to overrun until after dawn, when daylight would make the scene photogenic for news crews embedded with reinforcement units. Marsh delivered the order because he was a soldier, but the price was 72 lives he couldn't justify, and a captain who saved them by refusing to obey. The court-martial was organized from the Pentagon to punish Frank for exposing that the operation was political calculation rather than military necessity. The dishonorable discharge was meant to discredit him, ensure no one would listen if he tried to tell the truth. Marsh went along because he'd been told his career would end otherwise, because he had 25 years he didn't want to lose. The colonel's final words were simple. He'd kept the files hidden because releasing them while alive would destroy people who didn't deserve it, officers caught in the same system. But now dying, it didn't matter. Frank could do whatever he wanted with the information, make it public, burn it, keep it locked away. The choice was Frank's, the way it should have been from the beginning. Frank noticed something else reading through again. Between pages 3 and 4, the pagination jumped. Page numbers went from 3 to 5. Either Marsh made a numbering mistake, or there had been a 4th page no longer in the envelope. Frank checked the box 3 times, searched every corner of the storage unit. The missing page never appeared. Whatever Marsh wrote on that page, whatever detail or name or evidence it contained, someone had removed it before the box reached Frank. Which meant someone else knew about the storage unit, had access, had gone through contents and decided that particular page needed to disappear. Frank sat in that motel room for 2 days, going through files and recordings repeatedly, deciding what to do. The evidence was damning, probably enough to reopen his court-martial and clear his name. Might even implicate people who made those decisions, though most were likely retired or dead. He could take it to a journalist, force the story out, make the Army acknowledge what was done, or do what Marsh did, keep it locked away, let the past stay buried. The problem, neither felt right. Going public would vindicate him, but hurt people caught in the same system. Keeping it secret meant carrying the weight alone, the way he'd been doing for 17 years. In the end, Frank chose a middle path. He made copies of the most important files and recordings, stored them in different locations. The originals went back into boxes, locked in his own storage unit. He wrote a detailed summary of everything he found, named names where he could, and noted gaps where information had been redacted, and sealed it in an envelope addressed to a lawyer he trusted. The instructions were clear. If Frank died under suspicious circumstances or disappeared exceeding 72 hours without contact, the envelope was to be opened and contents distributed to major news outlets and military oversight committees. A dead man's switch, insurance you hope you never need but can't afford to be without. The lawyer asked only one question. Are you sure you want to carry this? Frank wasn't sure of anything except that the truth deserved to exist somewhere, held by someone, even if it never saw daylight. What Frank didn't tell the lawyer was that someone already knew about the files. The missing page proved that. Someone had accessed the storage unit before Frank arrived, gone through contents carefully enough to know which specific page needed removing. That someone might be watching now, waiting to see what Frank would do. The dead man's switch wasn't just insurance against accident. It was a message to whoever took that page. I know you're out there, and I've made sure you can't silence this quietly. Then he went home to Helen and tried to figure out how to live with what he knew. The years that followed were quieter, but no less complicated. Frank continued working, retired eventually, spent time with Helen's grandchildren, and tried to be the kind of person who didn't dwell on the past. But the files were always there in the back of his mind, a weight he carried that nobody else could see. He kept 2 lists now, not one. The first list contained the names of the men from Kandahar in 1987, the operation that should have killed them, but didn't because of faulty intelligence and American boot prints in an unmined canyon. The second list, the one that people whispered about in certain circles, contained 72 names from Ramadi in 2006, men who walked out of a different valley because Frank had learned the lesson about disobeying orders when the math didn't add up. The Kandahar list got shorter as the years passed, men dying from illness or accident, or just the slow accumulation of years. Each time a name disappeared, Frank felt it like a personal loss, like the justification for his decision was being eroded one death at a time. By the time he turned 70, only 43 of the original unit were still alive, and Frank wondered what would happen when the last one died, when there was nobody left who remembered that night except him. The Ramadi list stayed longer, younger men who had decades ahead of them, but Frank knew that time would take them too eventually. Both operations existed in a strange parallel, separated by 19 years and thousands of miles, but connected by the same choice made twice: trust your eyes and your instincts over orders that don't match reality. What connected them in ways Frank couldn't explain to anyone was the unknown civilian voice on those command channel recordings. That same careful precision, that same political language about acceptable losses and domestic consumption. Frank had heard that voice twice in his career, once in 1987 and once in 2006, separated by nearly 2 decades, but identical in tone and purpose. Same patterns, same calculated positioning of units in kill zones, same timing designed to produce maximum political impact. Different wars, different theaters, but the same system that treated soldiers as expendable assets in a larger game Frank could only partially see. He had never identified the voice, couldn't match it to any official in any archived footage or congressional hearing he'd watched over the years. Whoever that person was, they had been operating in shadows for at least 2 decades, possibly longer, making decisions that cost lives to serve objectives Frank still didn't fully understand. The question became more urgent when Frank's own health started to decline. Nothing dramatic, just the usual warnings that make you aware of mortality. Helen insisted he get his affairs in order, but the real work wasn't about the house or the money. The real work was deciding what to do with the files, with evidence that could rewrite military history if anyone cared to listen. He thought about destroying them, about going public, but neither felt right. The truth deserved to exist, but it also deserved to be handled carefully. Frank decided to keep making recordings, audio files explaining everything in his own words. He bought a microphone and software, started speaking into the darkness of his home office late at night when Helen was asleep. He talked about Kandahar 1987, about the decision and consequences. He talked about Marsh and the files, about operations designed to sacrifice soldiers for political gain. He talked about the men from both operations, named them one by one, described their lives after those nights. The recordings grew into hours of material, Frank's voice steady but tired, carrying a burden for so long that putting it down felt impossible. One recording includes the original Kandahar tape. He digitized it carefully, preserving the static and distant gunfire and the tight exchange between him and Marsh. Then, he recorded commentary overlaying the historical audio, explaining what was really happening in each moment. The result is strange dual narrative, young captain making life-or-death decisions in real time, old man reflecting decades later. At one point, Frank pauses the original and adds something he's never told anyone. In the background of Marsh's transmission, barely audible beneath static, there's a second conversation. 2 voices arguing in a room that should have been private. One is Marsh, the other is that unknown civilian, and if you listen carefully with volume turned up, you can hear 4 words. The senator needs this. Frank spent hundreds of hours trying to identify which senator, which committee, which timeline would make 72 casualties worth orchestrating. He never found the answer. The missing page from Marsh's letter probably contained that information, and whoever removed it made sure that truth stayed buried. But Frank kept the recording, kept the barely audible voices preserved in digital format, because someday someone with better technology might enhance that audio enough to identify the speaker. Long shot, maybe impossible, but it's the closest thing to justice Frank can leave behind. The last recording Frank made is different from the others. He doesn't talk about the valley or the court-martial or the files. Instead, he talks about what it means to make a choice when all the options are bad, when following orders means watching people die, and disobeying orders means accepting consequences that will follow you for the rest of your life. He talks about the weight of command, the way it sits on your shoulders and never quite goes away, even after you've been discharged and stripped of your rank. He talks about the 72 men, the ones who are still alive and the ones who have died since, and how each of them represents a life that continued because of a decision made in a few desperate seconds. Frank's voice breaks at one point in the recording, the only time in hours of audio that his control slips. He talks about seeing James Kearney's son at the funeral, hearing that his former second-in-command had never regretted following him into that canyon. That memory, more than anything else, feels like vindication. Frank Holloway is 81 years old now. He still lives in the same house with Helen, still has the storage unit with the boxes from Colonel Marsh, still has the recordings locked in a folder on his computer that nobody else knows how to access. The list of names is down to 37, men in their 60s and 70s who are living out their retirements with families and hobbies and stories they probably don't tell very often. Frank sometimes wonders if any of them think about that night, if they remember the fear and the gunfire, and the moment when their captain told them to pack up and move in direct defiance of orders. He wonders if they know what it cost him, if they care, if it would change anything if they did. The truth is that it doesn't matter. Frank didn't make the decision for gratitude or recognition. He made it because 72 lives were in his hands, and he couldn't sit there and watch them be sacrificed for a tactical objective that made sense to people who were 200 miles away and didn't have to look those soldiers in the eye. The files and recordings will outlive Frank. He's arranged for them to be transferred to a military history archive after his death, with instructions they not be released until certain conditions are met: death of the last surviving member from Kandahar or 50 years after the operation, whichever comes first. By then, everyone involved will be dead or too old to care, and the truth can come out without destroying lives. What they don't know is that there are 2 other cassettes in his archive, not from 1987. They're dated 2004 and 2006. Different theaters, different operations, but same patterns, same unknown voice-giving orders that don't match tactical reality. Frank's been collecting evidence for 40 years, not to change anything, but because someone needs to document what happened. Someone needs to leave a trail for historians who will try to understand how decisions got made and why men died in valleys serving no strategic purpose beyond satisfying political requirements. Frank Holloway is 81 now. He still lives with Helen, still has the storage unit, still has encrypted recordings nobody else can access. The Kandahar list is down to 37 names, men in their 60s and 70s living out retirements with families and stories they probably don't tell. The Ramadi list has barely started to shrink, men in their 40s and 50s with most of their lives ahead. Frank sometimes wonders if they think about those nights, if they remember the fear and gunfire and the moment their commander told them to move in defiance of orders. He wonders if they know what it cost him, if they care. The truth is, it doesn't matter. Frank didn't make the decisions for gratitude. He made them because lives were in his hands, and he couldn't watch them be sacrificed for objectives that made sense to people hundreds of miles away who didn't have to look those soldiers in the eye. The math was always simple. Men lived who were supposed to die, and that has to count for something. It has to mean the choices were right, even if consequences were wrong. The tape sits in climate-controlled storage now, along with files and recordings telling stories the Army would prefer to forget. Frank visits sometimes, making sure everything's still there, organized for whoever finds it someday. He doesn't listen to the tapes anymore. The voices are in his head already, his own and Marsh's and that unknown civilian whose identity Frank will probably never learn. Those voices will stay with him until the end, along with lists that get shorter every year and the knowledge that he saved them all, twice, in 2 different wars separated by 19 years and connected by the same willingness to trust his eyes over his orders. One tape remains sealed, marked only with a date, November 2006. Frank has never digitized it, never transcribed it, never told anyone what's on it. The label is in his own handwriting this time. Whatever that tape contains, Frank decided it stays locked until enough time has passed that the truth won't destroy people who don't deserve it. Maybe that's cowardice, maybe mercy. Frank stopped trying to tell the difference years ago. Frank Holloway disobeyed orders and saved 72 lives. Then he did it again. And then he spent 4 decades living with what that meant, collecting evidence that might never see daylight, protecting men who don't know they need protecting from a truth that could destroy their peace. The files will tell the story. Eventually, when enough time has passed. Until then, the tapes stay hidden, proof of decisions that were right and wrong at the same time, evidence of nights when one man chose to trust his instincts over orders from people who measured success in body counts and appropriations votes. And that's why the tape was never supposed to be found.